Can you define economic value? As an entrepreneur, you're in continuous pursuit of value for others and for yourself. It's super important, therefore, to know what it is. Since it's dynamic and changing, only the freshest economic thinking will do. Let's listen to Mark Packard.
This is the Economics for Entrepreneurs podcast, a project of the Mises Institute, applying the principles of economics to start, grow, and manage your business. For free tools, resources, key takeaways, and actionable insights from each episode, visit Mises.org/E4EPod. Now, here's Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Today we're going to talk more about economic value, including answering the question, what is it? Understanding value is fundamental to business success. Our guest, Dr. Mark Packard, has defined entrepreneurship as the intentional pursuit of value. It's what you do as an entrepreneur. So it's imperative to understand it. And with today's episode, we think we can advance your value insights to a point where we can help you build advantage in the marketplace. So what is value? Business schools and business books often talk about creating value, i.e. value, in their view, is something embedded in the product or service a firm produces. It's formed in the producer's domain. It results from internal resources and processes. The firm uses marketing and sales and distribution to make customers aware of the value and persuade them to purchase and to use. Over the past 10 to 15 years, the business schools have ceded a little bit of the value creation process to the customer in a method they have dubbed co-creation of value. Here, the firm still designs the product or service with inherent value, but it's recognized that the value is realized only when the customer uses the service. And since customer circumstances and methods of use and judgments about utility are all different, the customer is indeed co-creating that value. For example, if the customer buys the product and doesn't use it, no value is realized. But Austrians know that even this concession to the customer's role is not enough to fully understand economic value. The Austrian economics theories of customer sovereignty and subjective value guide us to the logical conclusion that all value formation is in the customer's domain. 100% of it. That's because value is a feeling on the part of the customer, a perception in their mind. You can't co-create a feeling. As Carl Menger explained in 1871, value does not exist outside the consciousness of men. We can't say that today. We'd have to say outside the consciousness of people or of customers or of consumers, but the point remains the same. But just as it's taken a century for Austrian capital theory to be fully realized and fully applied through what we call today agile methods and digitization, so it has not been until right now that the full implications of Austrian value theory can be applied. Dr. Mark Packard has brought modern neuroscience, advanced psychology, Austrian economics, and customer research together to bring us a new breakthrough. The headline is that value is not a thing, not a quality, not an attribute. It's a process. It's a cognitive and experiential process in the mind of the customer. It's a process that, for entrepreneurs who absorb it, internalize it, and activate it, can result in a marketplace advantage in finding the right customers, engaging commercially with those customers during their value learning process, and delighting them as an outcome of that process. In this way, value is truly subjective, 100% in the customer's domain, and facilitating value, not trying perhaps frustratingly to create it, becomes the key to entrepreneurial success. Let's dive in and meet Professor Mark Packard. Mark teaches at the University of Nevada in Reno, focusing on the nature, source, and process of entrepreneurship. He holds a PhD in business management from the University of Missouri, where his emphasis was on strategic management, innovation, and corporate entrepreneurship. His research is truly exciting and cutting edge, and it's generating great new thinking and great new tools for entrepreneurs. Mark, hello.
Hey, Hunter.
Welcome to Economics for Entrepreneurs.
Thanks.
We have a very specific goal today, Mark. We're going to share your advanced thinking, which I've been following recently with our listeners, in a specific way to help them apply it to our business. Your advanced thinking is about value. And in fact, you've defined entrepreneurship as the intentional pursuit of value. So we'll dig into that, but clearly value thinking is central to the entrepreneurial process. And your value theory has tremendous insights to help businesses grow their revenues and profits. So that's our goal today. And the best place to start, I think, is with definitions. How do you define economic value?
Yeah, it's a good question. We like to say that value is subjective, but what does that mean? And actually, economists don't really agree on this, not even Austrians. So do you want a little of the background history of the value concept?
Yeah, I think it would be good to give our listeners a little bit of history.
Okay. So the first value concept that historians that I know of have found was utility. And it dates back, millennia. Apparently, several ancient philosophers had some kind of utility concept. But the origins of the modern utility concept is probably attributable to Aristotle, who distinguished between use value and exchange value, which is pretty familiar to a lot of economists, maybe not so much practitioners. But that use value has been called utility by several people, which is the usefulness of some good towards satisfying someone's wants. Now, along comes Adam Smith in the late 18th century, and one of his primary goals is to unravel where prices come from. And so he considered utility as one of the primary factors in determining prices, but he ultimately rejected utility because of what has been called the value paradox, which is that some things have significant utility, but have low prices, like water and air. They're super valuable, important to our well-being and life sustenance, and
can't live without them.
Yeah, but they're almost costless, right, in terms of the prices. But other things have very little utility, but extremely high prices, right? So like precious gems and diamonds, or collectibles, you don't use them really, or you don't need them at least, but they have really high prices. So this paradox led Adam Smith to ultimately reject the utility concept as the base of value and of prices. And instead, he proposed a cost theory of value, meaning that prices or the value is determined by the cost of its production. And that was at first received very well by contemporary economists like David Ricardo. Then, of course, along comes Karl Marx. And Karl Marx says, well, wait, if value is based on the cost of production, well, then you have the cost of what goes into that cost of production. You've got the cost of labor and then the cost of the materials to produce a particular good. But where do the costs of those materials, productive materials, come from? Well, those also come from the cost of labor and of the materials to produce or extract them. And those materials, again, come from labor and some other materials and so on. And so it is this regressive, infinite loop that goes all the way back to basically all of the costs are labor costs in the end. And I think Marx was right on that, right? So a cost theory of value ultimately collapses into a pure labor theory of value. That value is determined by the labor expended to produce it. So this was Marx's insight, this labor theory of value, which was a key piece of his anti-capitalist theory. But of course, by now we know that, all kinds of problems with the labor theory of value. They're pretty obvious to us now. I don't know if we need to really expound on that.
No, let's get to the next stage.
Yep. So around in the early 1870s, in fact, it was 1871. In 1871, three economists, William Stanley Jevons, Leon Walras, and Carl Menger, all in the same year came up with a solution to the value paradox that prevented economists from accepting utility as the basis of value, and that's called marginal utility theory. They call it the marginal revolution that started in 1871, and it was just so persuasive and compelling that it just destroyed and swept away the cost and labor theories of value shortly thereafter. So the marginal utility theory view is that prices are determined by what we call their marginal utility, which means the lowest valued utility that the total supply of a good affords. So maybe think about it this way. What's the most valuable use for a good? So based on that, you satisfy all the needs for that particular use. And do you have any of the supply left over? If so, you get to move down to the second best use and satisfy as much of that with the remaining supply as you can. And if you have any left over after that, you get to go to the next level, the third best use, and supply as much of that as possible. And keep going down as far as the supply allows. And that last and least useful use that the supply allows, that's your marginal utility. And that's the one that determines the price, because the supply is large enough that competition will drive the price down to that level. Did that kind of make sense?
Yes, it does. Absolutely. I think that's a great history. And then take us to the next step of how do we get to subjective value from there?
Okay, so why is value subjective? Most economists believe that utility is subjective because how useful a thing is, its utility depends on the individual. It's different for every person, right? But notice that this concept of subjective utility is only subjective in the sense that it's individually unique. But in principle, individual utility for any person could be known a priori, right?
Mm-hmm.
But is that right? Can we know how much utility a good has for a specific person before they consume it? I don't know. We can make educated guesses, but some have argued that you can't know how useful a thing is until that utility is actually attained, at least not perfectly. So some have argued, and I think rightly, that value isn't a quality of a good; it's usefulness, but that a good only becomes valuable if and when it's used, right? So value is the service or benefit that a good actually performs when used. So let's say you bought a snack from the grocery store because it seemed to have, at the time, some utility in satisfying your hunger, but you never actually ate it, and it gets moldy, and you have to toss it out. Did that snack have any real value? This is where economists disagree. Some say yes, it had real utility and thus value. It was just never actualized. And then others say, no, you can't have unactualized value. If it wasn't used and if it didn't create a benefit, there was no value. So I fall into this camp. That defining value as utility is counting your chickens before they hatch. So my definition, the way I define subjective value, is the individual benefit that one experiences when satisfying a need. It's the relief of felt uneasiness, as Mises like to say. It's an improvement in your quality of life. So that's subjective value. In other words, something is valuable if and when it makes us better off because it satisfied a need. A good's not valuable per se unless and until it does so. And until then, whatever utility we ascribe to a good is only a prediction of future value.
Well, let's just drill down into a couple of concepts that you've brought up, Mark, which are really, really useful for entrepreneurs, but demand a little bit of hard thinking. The first is this idea of value as a a perception of the individual. You said it's the service that the individual experiences, and this is a really difficult concept for entrepreneurs to think about because a feeling is hard to measure, it's hard to engineer, it's hard to plan for, it's hard to design for, it's hard to build a process for. Whereas thinking of value as something embedded in a good or service is somewhat more straightforward. So talk a little bit more, if you would, please, about this concept of value as a feeling and how it fits into the entrepreneur's process. How can entrepreneurs induce a feeling?
Yeah. So this is really important for entrepreneurs to grasp, and if you do understand it, you'll have a big advantage against competitors that don't. So value is experienced benefit according to my definition, right? So what does that mean? A proper answer to that question actually kind of requires us to dig a bit into philosophy, and I don't want to go too far into the weeds here, but Austrians, or at least Misesians, subscribe to what's sometimes called methodological dualism. Today, philosophers tend to just call it representationalism, but what it means is that there's a difference, a separation between the physical realm and the cognitive realm, between reality and its perception. In other words, what we can consciously experience in our minds isn't always or necessarily what's really real. We perceive reality through our senses, but really it's just a sense stimuli that our brains interpret. Have you ever seen the movie The Matrix?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So the premise of that movie, the ability to create an artificial reality for people that seems perfectly real, is based on this idea of representationalism, which by now is the prevailing view since the evidence is pretty overwhelming. So if we accept this view that perception isn't necessarily reality, then what does this mean for value? Well, it means that there's two sides to the value experience. There's an objective side, or the reality, the real side, and a subjective or perceived side. The objective or physical side, the physical experience, real experience, is the real benefit that a consumer experiences, the actual objective increase to their well-being. They're objectively better off as a result of a value experience. And the subjective or conscious side of that experience is the perceived benefit that they gain. So, for example, which one produces a greater benefit to a consumer, a salad or ice cream?
Yeah, depends on who you are and where you are and what time of day it is and all of those things, right?
Yeah, in particular, it depends on what you even mean, right? If you're talking about the actual physical benefit, the delivery of nutrition and a corresponding increase in your physiological well-being, then you probably have to say the salad, right? The salad is more nutritious and better for your body. But if you mean which is the more enjoyable experience, then you might say the ice cream. If the ice cream felt more satisfying, you might feel better when eating the ice cream, at least in that moment. So there's a difference between the objective experience and the subjective experience. So which one of those is more important for entrepreneurship, to entrepreneurs? Which one does the consumer learn from and act upon?
Well, we've always communicated that, Mark, as kind of a ladder, the means end ladder that we have talked about, where the functional benefit, this tastes good, is a first step. And then what we've been calling the emotional benefit, maybe you call it the perceived benefit. I feel good about eating this salad, or I feel indulged by eating this ice cream. That's an emotional concept. And that's the next step on the ladder. It's got to taste good first, and then it has to deliver the emotional benefit. Does that fit into your thinking?
Yeah, I like your latter idea pretty well. In terms of methodological dualism or this representationalism, all you have access to when you are making decisions on and choosing how to act is what you have in your mind. It's you don't have access to some kind of objective, real criteria or something. So all you have is your knowledge. So it's just really your subjective experience and what you've learned from it that you base your decisions on, because that's the only part of that experience that they're really aware of. So that's a pretty interesting insight that consumers experience and learn from just the subjective component of the value experience, but their real benefit, their well-being, depends on the objective side of it. So this doesn't mean that entrepreneurs should only focus on creating the most stimulating experiences possible, because consumers are trying to figure out what really makes them better off. So over time, they learn that they don't really they don't really feel all that well eating ice cream all the time. We've learned better. So over time, consumers learn to prefer products that give them real objective benefit, and not just the subjective benefit. But it's a kind of a slow learning process. And so what this means is that products that are the most stimulating tend to dominate a market in the short run, in the early goings. But over time, that gives way to the products that offer the most real benefits. Of course, ideally, the ideal is that you can do both, right? The most highly valued and sustainable products are those that offer real benefits and highly satisfying experiences. So customer satisfaction is absolutely vital to entrepreneurial success, but it can become a red herring if you're not careful. Long run success generally requires that you create a solution that your customers really need, and not just experiences that give them a nice quick shot of dopamine.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to get off the ground at all, though, if your customers don't feel satisfied when they consume your product. So you'll probably need both, especially if your product is a new idea. But if you're entering an established industry, you could probably get away with focusing on the objective experience, the real benefit, because customers are already somewhat educated by now on what works and what doesn't in the long run.
So do you have an example in mind, Mark, of what you just said, which is extremely interesting, that the short-term versus long-term developments of markets? And I'll put up a straw man if you want to consider it, and that's the food industry, which you can look at as having created lots of those short-term stimuli, if you like, the salt hits and the sugar hits in processed food and sodas and chocolate and things like that. And now the market is kind of turning to maybe what you talk about as your longer term benefit, where they're thinking about nutrition, and they're thinking about health, and they're maybe discounting the short term flavor hits, and they're emphasizing the longer term nutritional benefits. Is that an example?
Yeah, it's a great example. So, I mean, I'm on a ketogenic diet right now, and honestly, getting on keto is pretty tough at first, because you crave those carbs and the sugars, and they're tough to give up. But because we've learned what's better for our bodies, we push ourselves and try to discipline ourselves to do what's best for us objectively, the real benefit. And so there's a lot of people that are following very strict diets, and they've disciplined themselves that way over the long run. And so keto foods are growing in terms of sales volumes, and other diets are pretty popular too. But of course, there are a lot of people that still love, not so disciplined. They don't care so much about their physical health and still crave the sugars and stuff that's not super healthy.
Yeah. Although there are innovations from entrepreneurs that can try and straddle that. I'm familiar with a chocolate brand called HU, I think it is, and it's HU as in human, and it's good for humans, both the people who grow the cocoa and the consumers who consume this, and still got a high taste amplitude, but it doesn't have as many bad ingredients. It's more thoughtful about the planet. and those kinds of things. So you can balance both sides of those, maybe, if you're a thoughtful innovator.
Yeah. So the foods that are going to really win and dominate the industry in the long run are good for you and good tasting if you can achieve it.
Yeah, good. Functional benefits and emotional benefits.
Yep.
Mark Packard and I are talking about the consumer's value learning process. It's a journey for them. The entrepreneur's on a journey too, to keep up with the consumer and to get ahead of them if possible, in order to make a value proposition that's new and different and better. You can learn the process of the Austrian entrepreneur's journey in our online course that takes you from the very beginning of the process to start, manage, and grow your business. Check it out at e4epod.com/journey. That's the letter E, the number 4, the letter E, pod.com/journey. And now back to our conversation to find out more. So let's keep advancing this idea. Now we're firmly defined the perceived value. You mentioned earlier the service logic, the buying the snack in the convenience store, but there's no value embedded in it. The value only occurs when the consumer consumes it and develops the perception. So speak to us about that service logic. Is that a good way to think about how we deliver that value? We've got to provide a service that the customer wants.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's not complete, but what's called the service dominant logic was proposed by a couple of marketing professors. Originally in 2004, it was Stephen Vargo and Robert Lush, I think
Vargo and Lush
is the way you pronounce his name. But their paper in 2004 made a big splash in the marketing field at the time, and it's still kind of building momentum right now. But really, it's kind of an old perspective that they kind of resurrected. And in fact, they acknowledge that the historical origins came from Friedrich Bastiat, who, as you probably know, is a highly regarded French scholar. He's highly regarded in the Austrian school and Austrian circles, and is kind of considered a proto-Austrian. But the gist of the perspective is, as I sort of said before, that value is experienced, right? So value isn't in the goods themselves, but in the services or benefits that they provide consumers. So yeah, this is a nice step forward in modern social science, away from what Vargo and Lush call mainstream economics goods dominant logic,
right, into
the service dominant logic, thinking of value as being in the service that those goods provide. Yeah. So I find it pretty well aligned with Austrian value theory, but still it's only half of the story, because it doesn't really make the distinction between objective experience and subjective experience. It focuses on the subjective experience, but overlooks the objective aspect of it.
Well, let me pick out one element of service dominant logic, Mark, because I think this is useful for entrepreneurs to think about at this stage, and then I'm going to encourage you to take it to the next stage. But the service logic phase recognizes the customer as a co-creator of value. That's the terms that they use, that the entrepreneur is not creating value. The entrepreneur is co-creating it with the customer. It takes the customer to eat the snack for the value to be created. So just comment on that idea, this co-creation of value.
Yeah, right. So if value is experienced benefit, as we've defined it, well, that experience is not always, or at least only, created by the producer of the good, but also in part by the consumer who actually performs the consumption task, right? So a lot of things you have to consume the right way to get the most value out of it. Take a Netflix subscription, for example. How much value do you get out of your Netflix subscription? Well, it depends on what you choose to watch, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to kind of pick the shows that you think would be most interesting to you and most valuable, And so the value that Netflix gives you depends on your own um, contribution to that, right? Another example: are you a wine drinker?
I am enthusiastic.
Well, I'm not, but it's pretty well known that your wine drinking experience depends on how you drink the wine, right?
Yep. So they say.
Yeah, what foods you pair it with, and what glassware you use, and temperature of the wine, and stuff like that. So wine drinkers have this kind of method of how they drink the wine to get the best experience out of that. And if you just pop the bottle, drink it straight out of the bottle with some corn chips or something, probably not the same experience.
But so I understand that's in my domain. But going back to the Netflix experience, Netflix has a job there to help me to make good choices by arraying the offerings in certain ways based on my previous behavior, giving me access to commentary by other people that I might respect, and helping me to make a good choice. So that I can see that as co-creation. I like that example.
Yeah, so that's a great point, because sometimes products don't deliver as much value as they could because consumers don't know how to consume those products optimally. So entrepreneurs need to be aware that they might need to help educate their customers and walk them through the consumption process to maximize that experience.
Another part of co-creation, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, is the ability to listen to complaints and the consumption errors, you call them, but the way that consumers didn't like what you were providing to them, responding to that and going back to them and saying, hey, here's the new improved version. Is that co-creation as well, listening to the customer and responding to them?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, if value emerges in the customer experience, then if you, the entrepreneur, are going to facilitate a value experience for them, you have to understand what the customer's needs are and what their need experience is like. And so to do that, you have to kind of get into their heads. You have to be in constant contact with them, especially when and while they experience the need that you're trying to address. So observe them in those situations. How do they now deal with that need? What are the current solutions that they're using? And talk to them and ask them what it's like for them. It's often very difficult to explain your own personal experience to someone else. It's because it's what we call tacit knowledge. But if you can embed yourself into their circumstances, you'll come to understand at a much deeper level what their experience is like and what type of solution would work for them and what would really facilitate real value for them.
Yeah, and that's use of what we're always calling empathy as the skill to be able to do that. But I don't want to go into empathy. I want to snapshot something you said, which is the entrepreneur facilitates value. So the old view is the entrepreneur creates value. We've got to an interim step here, which is the entrepreneur facilitates value. So just snapshot that for us. What does it mean to facilitate value?
Yeah, so even many Austrians still tend to use the language of value creation, but it is imprecise and it's misleading. So Pear and I and some others are really trying to push us away from this idea of creation of value. So what you can create or co-create with the customer is the experience, but you really have little control of what value is actually extracted from that experience. In fact, there's a whole lot that influences that subjective experience, including the timing of the consumption, consumers' expectations of what they'll get out of it, their mood, environment, and stuff like that. So you co-create an experience for customers, which that experience facilitates their subjective value. So producers don't create value; they only facilitate it. But a question I get a lot is, okay, fine, but so what? What does thinking of value as facilitated instead of created give us? That's new, and it's a good question. If you think of value as being created, then you lose or at least attenuate the concept of value uncertainty. When you create a product or a service, is that product valuable? Have you created a valuable product? Well, no, what you've created is what we call a value proposition. You are proposing a solution for consumers' consideration, which you hope they'll be willing to pay for. If you think about your product as being valuable, that its value is already established, then you're prone to overconfidence in your predictions, right? In accounting, for example, it's very tempting to take stock of your inventory and assign it a monetary value. But how accurate is that accounting valuation? If you understand that value is merely facilitated, then you recognize that your inventory may or may not sell and that preferences may change, and so may your prices. So if you have unsold inventory, what's the true value of it?
It depends. We'll wait and see, right?
Yeah, right now it's zero. It's unsold and it's unused because unused goods have facilitated no value experience. So that's not to say it's not worth estimating or predicting the expected exchange value. Of course it is. But entrepreneurs can get into trouble when thinking in terms of value creation instead of value facilitation. If you understand that your value proposition is uncertain, then you'll be far less in love with your idea and much more willing to change it if and when it doesn't deliver as much value as hoped, and you need to adapt.
So there's value uncertainty in the entrepreneur's part, but I think if I understand your research right, Mark, there's value uncertainty with the customer as well. And you talk about a customer behavior that you title valuation. They're doing valuation. And I think there's a predictive part of that where they're considering what value they might get from a value proposition. And then there's the experienced value and the assessment after the experience. So can you walk us through that, how the customer does valuation?
Yeah. So real value or experienced benefit, as we've defined it, may be different from the subjective aspect of what I call one's valuation or assessment of that benefit. So again, that gets back to the difference between objective and subjective experience. So how valuable was a particular consumption experience to you? Well, according to our value theory here, consumers monitor their conscious experienced benefit by consciously representing that experience in their mind, right? So that's that representationalism that we talked about. And that's all they have mental access to, this represented or subjective experience. Mm-hmm. So this is the experience that they learn from and the experience that they end up evaluating. But let me say something real quick about why we assess our value experiences, because this is something I think that some of the foundational Austrian theorists like Menger and Baumgartner and Mises really got right, but their ideas still haven't fully caught on.
Okay.
Let me start with Mises real quick. So why do we assess our value experiences and perform what I call an assessment valuation? Well, the answer is, according to Mises, that we're in a constant learning process pointed toward optimizing our individual well-being, right? So the goal of everything we do is to somehow make our lives better. We start out our lives, as babies, we're ignorant of how to make ourselves well, but we learn over time through experience what things make us better and which things relieve our felt uneasiness, as Mises put it. And we store that experiential knowledge away so we can reproduce that behavior and consumer action when that same uneasiness arises again. But let me ask you, why do we try new things? Like why might you order something different from the menu of your favorite restaurant?
As a kind of discovery process, I imagine. What will it be like?
Yeah, right. So we're not just trying to reproduce our best known experiences in the past. We're also trying to learn potentially better ways to satisfy our needs. So this is actually how I define entrepreneurship, as you said at the beginning, that entrepreneurship is the intentional pursuit of new economic value for yourself or potentially for others. So it's not the reproduction of already learned value. It's trying to create new economic value, which can be done in various ways, right? Like creating new things to consume, or bringing known and established value to markets that don't have access to it yet, and stuff like that. But this means that we actually act as entrepreneurs all the time in our daily lives as we try to create new value knowledge and improve our standard of living through this discovery process, which is in line with the work of, I don't know if you've heard of Theodore Schultz, who is a Nobel laureate in economics. Peter Klein's done some work on him, and he's the one that turned me on to his work. But he's got what's called a human capital theory of entrepreneurship, where even the stay-at-home mom is sometimes an entrepreneur when she tries new recipes, reorganizes the furniture, buys new things, and so forth, right? All these activities reorganize her family's resources in new ways in an uncertain attempt to facilitate new and greater value experiences for her and for her family, right? So that's also entrepreneurship.
I also like Huerta de Soto talks about entrepreneurship that way. It's the creation of new knowledge that can better benefit yourself or benefit others. And he sees it as essential human action.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. So, I mean, it's the business venture in particular that typically creates the most new economic value, which is why we tend to focus on them, and reasonably so, because when we create economic value in bulk for masses, we are creating a whole lot more economic value. But you got to remember, though, that we are entrepreneurs in our own lives, creating new economic value for ourselves also as part of the economic growth process.
That's really helpful. But let's get back to the customer process here. I love your predicted value, experienced value, assessed value cycle, and I'd like to have you walk us through that.
Okay, yeah. So back to the assessment valuation. It's not just an assessment of the value experience alone, but in that process, we also ascribe the assessed value of the experience to the sources of it, and this was one of Menger's big contributions, which his students von Bauwerk and Wieser also expounded on. In Austrian economics, we call it imputation.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take as an example a steak dinner. Let's say you went to a steakhouse and you had an amazing experience eating a nice ribeye, and you assess that experience to be worth, some $40 of value ex post. Yeah, this is a simplification, but we don't necessarily translate our valuations into dollar figures per se, but it's useful to think that way, at least for examples. But who do you attribute or impute that $40 of value, assessed value, to? So who facilitated that $40 worth of value? In general, you'd probably impute that value to the restaurant, and that's my favorite steakhouse because of all the value that it produces. Let's say it charged only $20 for the steak and it gave you $40 of value. That's a nice consumer profit, consumer surplus, as we say. But if you impute the $40 value to the restaurant, then the restaurant imputes backwards that $40 valuation to, or at least the $20 that it charged, to the means by which it facilitated the experience, right? So to the food suppliers and the meat vendors, who in turn impute their value to the butcher and to the rancher that created the meat, and so forth, right? So there's this backwards imputation valuation where all the pieces that went into the experience get attributed some value or worth, which is where they kind of get their valuation and willingness to pay, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is actually the key task of the entrepreneur, to impute a value experience proportionally to its sources and to ensure that their contribution, the contribution of those pieces to the value experience, is greater than their cost. So in the end, all the pieces that come together to produce your value experience for your customer, we got to make sure that the value that we can obtain in a price, in exchange value, exceeds the costs, the economic costs on the market at the margin. And that's really what constitutes what we call entrepreneurial uncertainty.
Okay.
Do you want to go into the predictive valuation?
Yeah, I do. I find that fascinating that there's a little bit of a cycle here. If I'm a customer, before the consumption experience, I'm predicting a value, and after the consumption experience, I'm looking back and seeing whether it met my prediction. Is that broadly right? I mean, please explain it in more detail.
Right. So I started with the assessment valuation because our predictions for future consumption are based in our assessment valuations and what we've learned from them, right? So again, the purpose of our assessment valuation is to learn what things make us better off so that we can maintain a higher standard of living. So when we're confronted with new uneasiness, or when we're planning for it in the future because we know it's coming, like when we're going to get hungry again, we face a consumer choice in how to address it. What's the best way to satisfy my current or future need? And as consumers, we're allocating our scarce resources, including our wealth, our time, our effort, toward creating the optimal standard of living for ourselves and for our families. So we use that assessment valuation learning and that knowledge that value knowledge is what I call it, in predictions for future value, right? So when you go to the grocery store, you tend to pick out your favorite items for consumption based on, what facilitated the most value for you in the past. But what about something you've never tried before, like that new menu item? How do you predict that value? That's a more complicated process. It involves counterfactual or perspective imagination. Our minds are able to actually take our current experiential knowledge and add to it information about some new value proposition and use that information and knowledge to create a counterfactual model of what it would be like if things were like this, and simulate that, run that counterfactual model in our minds and create a mental experience, a predictive experience that way. And it's pretty fascinating. And so we use these counterfactual simulations to basically expect what the experience would be like and form from that what I call a predictive valuation of that experience. This is what the subjective experience will be like for me, and this is how much benefit I'll get from that. So let's say that you saw salmon on the menu of that steakhouse. So now you've got to decide whether to get the salmon or the steak, since you've already had the steak before, you kind of already know what that's going to be like. Your prediction of the steak is based on past experience, but your prediction of the salmon is not, because you've never had it before. So you've got to kind of imagine what that will be like and compare that value, that predictive value, to the predictive value of the steak, which is based on more evidence. So the salmon is a lot more uncertain, and you have to account for that in your assessment. That's why we tend to go with familiar items more often than not. But sometimes we're in the mood to be a little more adventurous and bear that uncertainty and try new things, which is pretty important in our progression toward a better standard of life.
And then we eat the salmon and we assess the value experience. Did we like it? Did we not? Did I get the ratio of salmon enjoyment to steak enjoyment right? Is that the kind of mental process that I'm going through?
Right. Yeah. So after you've made a decision based on your predictive valuation, and you now get to consume that value proposition, experience what it has to offer, and you get to assess that new value experience again. But your value experience is assessed according to and relative to your predictive valuation, right? So how much value did you expect to get versus how much did you actually get, or at least how much did you actually assess? Mm-hmm. So back to the steak example, let's say you chose to go for the steak again. So your new experience is going to be assessed against your past experiences with that steak. It wasn't as good this time or as it was last time, or man, they nailed it again.
Yeah.
But let's say you went with the salmon instead. Then your reaction might be something like, oh, it's even better than I expected, or it's not exactly what I was hoping for, right? So your assessment valuation is compared to what you were expecting. Now, this is actually pretty important and interesting because as a consumer, both your willingness to pay and your satisfaction, both of those, your ex ante valuation, your predictive valuation, the willingness to pay, and your assessment valuation, which is your satisfaction, depend on how much value you expect, your predictive valuation. So what this means as an entrepreneur is that you really have to manage your customers' expectations on a razor's edge. You need your customers to perceive enough value to have sufficiently high predictive valuation to ensure that to ensure a high enough willingness to pay that they are going to actually buy your product. But you can't hype your value proposition so much that their expectation causes a letdown, right? In fact, if you're a new business, you basically have to deliver an incredible, far beyond expectation value experience if you're going to generate that excitement and that satisfaction and buzz that you need to blow up your business. So you got to be very strategic about the price you set and the hype you generate and the value predictions that your customers have. It's actually a pretty strategic process that Austrian economics can really help explain and understand for entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Well, great, Mark. That's very exciting, and we're going to look into how Austrian economics and some of the tools you've developed can really help entrepreneurs in this process. So we've set the foundation today, I think, of your value as a learning experience process. It's a learning experience for the customer, and it's a learning experience for the entrepreneur too. They've got to observe and figure this out. So let me summarize what I think we've learned today, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and then we'll go on next time to look at the tools. So I'm a process map kind of guy, Mark, and I look at this as a process, and I see these 5 steps after the entrepreneurs developed a value proposition from listening to the customer, and the customer develops a predicted value. I think I might get something out of this. And that's kind of absolute. Yes, I will. No, I won't. It's their perception. They also then have to make that into a relative value. I'd rather choose this proposition than another one. I'd rather have the salmon than the steak. Then there's a value exchange. Money has to be exchanged to facilitate the next step. So the salmon's $30 and the steak's $40, and I think that gives me a good relative value. So I'll choose the salmon. Then I experience the value, and then I make a value assessment. I look back on that whole process and say, how was my value experience relative to my predicted value? Is that broadly correct?
Yeah. So yeah, that entrepreneurs would really benefit from realizing that their customers and consumers in general are in this infinite learning cycle that they're trying to figure out how to improve their own lives over time. And so as an entrepreneur, you want to take that journey with your customers in this learning process. You want to learn together. In some ways, you might be able to learn more about your customers' needs than they do, because after all, they have a lot of different needs that they're trying to manage and learn about. And that learning process is highly fallible. We don't always know what we need, and what we want is often not the best we could have. But we want to learn about better ways to do things. So successful entrepreneurs are the ones who can truly get into the lives and experiences of their customers in order to create a value proposition that delivers a much better value experience for their customers than what they now have. And then they have to convince those customers that it is better.
Well, let's stop there for today, Mark. As I say, we look forward to you coming back and telling us more about the tools and methods. I'm excited to hear that Austrian economics is in a place where we're on the cutting edge, and we're talking about representational neuroscience and those kinds of things. So that's exciting. We'll ask you to come back and talk about the specific methods and tools. In the meantime, we'll post a graphic that I hope represents what you've just taken us through today, and people can download it for free from the website. And we'll continue to delve into modern value theory because it's really an exciting place to be. So, Mark, thank you for sharing all your latest research with us today.
Great. Yeah, that was a pleasure. Thanks, Hunter.
We look forward to the next time. Bye for now.
Economics for Entrepreneurs is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more from Hunter Hastings, check out hunterhastings.com.